acceptance speech after receiving a special Health and Human Services Secretary's Award for her exceptional accomplishments in the field of minority health, Mary Stark Harper remarked that she left home against the will of my parents, who thought that instead of going to college, I should take a job as a housekeeper. Not only did she go to college, she became one of nursing's most respected leaders, eventually serving as an advisor to 4 US presidents. And it is in her honor that we have named this part of our leadership conference, whereby a respected leader reflects on lessons learned from a distinguished career. Harper was the first in this series to do such a master class, and she did it in 2002 at our second leadership conference. Dr. Harper's 65-year career, which began with her caring for an aging George Washington Carver, included various leadership positions at the National Institutes of Mental Health, where she initiated the National Research and Development Mental Health Centers for minority populations. She also helped implement the NIH's National Fellowship Program, which has enabled thousands of minority students to obtain advanced degrees. From 1979 to 1981, she was director of the White House Conference on Aging's Office of Policy Development and Research. She was a founding member of the National Black Nurses Association and the first project officer of the American Nurses Association's Minority Fellowship Program. Born and raised in Alabama, Dr. Harper earned a nursing diploma from Tuskegee University in 1941, bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Minnesota in the 1950s, and a doctorate from St. Louis University in 1962. Early in her career, she was the director of nursing education at the Tuskegee VA Hospital and also held clinical education and research positions at VA hospitals in other parts of the country. Her unwitting participation in the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study in the 1940s, and in fact, she was the last living person to have been involved in some capacity with that whole effort. But her unwitting involvement led her to become an advocate who fought for better health care for minorities, especially geriatric and psychiatric patients, as well as more ethical research policies. Dr. Harper went on to write 5 books and close to 200 articles, taught at universities from coast to coast, and lectured around the world. Tuskegee endowed a chair for gerontological nursing research in her honor, and in 2001, the University of Alabama dedicated the country's first state-supported geriatric psychiatric hospital in her name. So a nurse having a hospital named after her. Well, in the spirit of Dr. Harper's interprofessional leadership, we reflect today on the career of Dr. May Weichel, who will be interviewed by her longstanding Francis Payne Bolton School of Nursing colleague, Dr. Diana Morris, who heads the University Center on Aging and Health at Case Western Reserve. Just some of Dr. Weichel's achievements include serving as a member herself of the White House Conference on Aging and on the advisory board for Johnson & Johnson's National Campaign for Nursing Future, receiving the National Black Nurses Association's Lifetime Achievement Award, being appointed the first Pope Eminent Scholar at the Rosalind Carter Institute for Human Development at Georgia Southwestern State University, serving as the 24th president of Sigma Theta Tau International, and being named last year a living legend by the American Academy of Nursing. I give you with great pleasure a wonderful part of time reminiscing with Dr. May Weichel, the living legend, and we keep on living.
Thank you, Angela, for the introductions. And I personally want to give my thanks to Angela and Taylor for inviting me to be here with May today. May has been my mentor and become my colleague and friend. And I have to say, Mary Harper was my first program officer at NIMH. And I learned at the end of the workday, when she would call you, was more like 1 or 2 a.m., not 5 p.m. But it's a pleasure to be here. And I think it's apropos that in terms of this master class, so to speak, on leadership, that May's going to share her narrative because she's a great storyteller. She's also a psych nurse, so narratives are important. So let us begin. May, I know often you talk about your coming up in Southern Ohio, rural Southern Ohio, when in a time when, as you say it, bias was legal. And I would like you to start by telling us about your earliest memory of what led you to move into the nursing as a young child and thinking about your future.
Okay. Well, it's true I did grow up when bias was legal, and I like that term because once you know that it's a legal kind of thing, you accept it a lot more than you would if you didn't know that. So I grew up in a small town in Southern Ohio, Martins Ferry, Ohio, right on the river. And it was still during the time when, for example, most African Americans had to live on the other side of the railroad track because, you know, you had to really be somebody to be beyond the railroad track. And the nicest thing, though, about being in a small town was that the schools were integrated. And they were integrated because they said they couldn't afford to have separate but equal schools. So I was in an integrated school. But it was difficult at times going to class because even when I can remember being in, I can go back as kindergarten and knowing that I was singled out a lot by the teacher. I remember once I was, we had nourishments in the afternoon and I spilled my chocolate milk all over my dress. And the teacher then said to the rest of the class, I want you to stand up, all of you, and take a look at May back there. So you can imagine the humiliation that I felt in terms of knowing who I was. But the one thing that helped me was that I had a family. I had a father, and he was pretty belligerent in terms of what he thought about what I should do and not do. And he had always said to me that you can be anything you want to be, that is, but you have to work twice as hard in order to achieve. That was just something that he said all the time. And he also said that when I grew up, he thought I ought to be a nurse. Now, my dad had been to college and he had to drop out during the Depression, and he was in pre-med. And he said, I want your brother to be the doctor and you're going to be the nurse. And I said, why can't I be the doctor? Well, that's not what women do. He said that you'll be the nurse. Well, I said, well, if he can be a doctor, so can I. And so that's how I started out in school, you know, studying because I wanted to be as good as my brother, and who happened to be younger than me also. And I wanted to be a doctor. So I went to a high school. The high school was integrated, and it was kind of like sheltered because you're in this. I was in Mount Pleasant, Ohio, a little bit up from Martins Ferry. And it was a very sheltered town, and it was a Quaker town. And so that you didn't experience as much open bias. And so I went to school, and I got involved in, and I did go through, like we were saying earlier this afternoon, a very shy period where I didn't want to say anything or do anything, particularly since the teacher made fun of me. And so I soon quickly learned that I liked learning, and my father always supported that. And so I got involved in class activities, and when I became a senior, I was president of the class. This is where I first start my leadership, and that's becoming president of the class, and graduated second in my class. And after I graduated, I remember my geometry teacher, I got on the bus one summer and she said, you know, you could have been first in your class if it hadn't been for your old geometry teacher. And I had gotten everything right, plus I did an extra paper, and I had an average of over 100% in class, and she gave me a B+. And that was enough for me not to be first in class.
Well,
So,
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Did you want-
I was just going to say that because I was in that sheltered school, my first taste of segregation was we couldn't swim except on certain days. You could go to the next town and you could swim only on Mondays, and that was the day before they cleaned the pool. And that was just one of those things. But when I left and went on a trip to Washington, D.C., I thought, well, this is going to be wonderful. But that's where I really met segregation, and that is we couldn't go and stay in the same hotels. We couldn't even go to the amusement park. And I thought that was very, very strange that you weren't able, because I was not used to that. And I had a couple classmates that were really nice, and they stayed with me instead of my, you know, having to be somewhere all by myself. So that was something that really helped me. Now, I knew that there was prejudice in the world because we lived in a small town, and the gentleman who owned the grocery store was the Grand Master of the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, everybody knew it in the town. We'd go and we'd say, "Hi, Mr. Lynn, we know you belong to the Ku Klux Klan." I mean, it was just a different experience. And I remember walking home with my mother one night coming from church, and all of a sudden there was a cross burning in the field, and we started running. And I said, well, Mom, why are we running from the cross? Because I didn't understand what that meant. And not that any harm ever came to us, but it was just the whole idea that you were afraid to really be out after dark. And this was not in the South. This was Southern Ohio and up north, and there was still a lot of racism.
And as you move from being that high school student to a student nurse at Ruth Bryant and then into nursing, what kinds of experiences as a student and as a young clinical nurse helped you think about leadership roles or moved you into leadership roles?
Well, that's another story, and I am a storyteller, but when I graduated from high school, I decided that I wanted a summer job. And I went to the next town where it was Martins Ferry Hospital, and I was going to get a job as a nurse's aide. And what I didn't know is that the hospital was not, as far as the staff and doctors, and so it was not integrated. And so I went with a girlfriend of mine, and we went up to apply to be a nurse's aide. And they said, oh no, you can't come here as a nurse's aide. And I thought, well, why not? And she says, I tell you what you do, though. You go to the housekeeping, because we think you're better suited to go to housekeeping. And so we went to housekeeping, and housekeeping talked to us through the screen door and said, well, you're such nice, clean-looking girls. Why don't you try for a job in the kitchen? Then we went to the kitchen, and they said, we don't want you either. So there I was, I thought, and I'm on the corner, and I think this is an important part that shaped my life. And the physician who was head of the hospital, Dr. Wilson, saw me on the street, and he said to me, aren't you John Hinton's daughter? And I said, yes. He says, well, he said, I want you to know that your father is named after me. So when he was born, my grandmother named him after the doctor. And he said, and what are you doing? And I said, I'm looking for a job for the summer. And I said, there's none at the hospital. And so he said, well, you go home. And then he sent his chauffeur out to pick us up, to bring us back, because he said to the hospital they had 2 slots waiting for somebody to come. And he said they are to come into the class. Well, I thought, this is wonderful. When I told my father, I said, yeah, I'm named after him. Because that's the kind of father I had. But anyway, we went to work as a nurse's aide, and my first patient that they gave me was dead. Now, here you are, you're 18 years old. You have this patient, not only was he dead, but he had died from some illness, and he had tubes coming out of every orifice, and they said, you know, that's your job, you have to bathe him today. Well, there was a white gentleman who had his home was in the hospital because he'd been hurt in the mind, and he could stay there forever, they said. That was way before insurance. But everybody knew him. So we go there, and he says to me, you don't have to bathe him, he's dead, and they're playing a joke on you. And so you see, there's always people along the way that help you through some of those tough times, because I'm here to say that being the only one, even though we have strategies to work through it, it's a painful thing. It really is quite painful. And then one of the nurses' aides came up to me after I'd been there for 2 weeks, and she says, do you know what? She says, you're not so bad. She says, you know we were going to strike. And I said, what? She said, the whole hospital was going to strike if they admitted you into the nurses' aid program. And I said, I'm glad I didn't know that. So anyway, I worked as a nurse's aide, and I thought, nursing is pretty good, because I always wanted to go to college and be a physician. And I said, I like nursing. And some of the nurses there, because I worked all kinds of shifts, took me under their wing, and they taught me things like I could take blood pressures and do temps and did all kinds of things. And you have to remember, in a small hospital where there aren't any interns or residents, nurses did everything. And so I remember one night taking care of an older woman, and this is where I first got my taste of what it's like to take care of an older person. And she was in her 80s, and she was confused. And they said, she's got a high temp, and you have to give her alcohol sponge baths all night long. And I thought, I don't want to do that. But I did. Every 2 hours or so, you did that. I mean, they don't do that anymore, but that's what we did. And in the morning, her temperature was down. And the nurse came to me and said, I know that was hard for you, but she says you saved her life. And I mean, that was like, I could save somebody's life? And so from then on, I was really hooked on nursing, and I didn't think about being a physician anymore. So I went home and said to my dad, okay, I'm going to be a nurse. And so I had to work for a year as a nurse's aide before they would allow me to come into the nursing school. It was a diploma school in nursing. And I had to take a lot of tests before I got into. They had, I could spend all day in a room, and they kept throwing tests at me that I had to take. And I was pretty good at math. I'm not good at math anymore, but they were really saying, well, gee, she really is good at math. And so finally they said, okay, you can come into nursing here. And you have to remember, at that time, there weren't too many hospitals, particularly in Ohio, that accepted African Americans into the nursing program. And so I was really pleased to get the opportunity to go in. And I had to be, they always called me, they would do things like put me on show, like when the physician's son died, they made me stand by his casket because I was the only one, and his father thought that that would be nice for the whole community to see that I was an African American nurse at Martins Ferry Hospital.